the antagonism that the early settlers in the United States had for policing had to do with centralized policing and police societies rather than citizens controlling themselves as they govern themselves. And we have this goofy pattern in the United States of every tiny little village having its own police department. And internationally, for a long time, that was laughed at. But that was an extension of this basic idea of citizens policing themselves. Sure, they had to have some hired help in doing that. But yet the idea was citizens should police themselves, and the way to do that was to have local control over police departments. And for a while we were a laughing stock internationally because we didn't even know how many police departments we had at one particular time. A report came out in the 1960s that I'll mention a little bit later called the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice, and it said that there were 40,000 police departments in the United States. It turned out only a decade later they found out it was a typo. It was supposed to be 20,000, but nobody knew and nobody even recognized that it was a typo. But again, the whole idea was this principle of citizens governing themselves. Now, the argument, and part of it is represented in the material you've been provided. The argument that I have made over the past 35, 40 years that I've been involved in this is that policing lost its way during most of the 20th century and only found itself as it began to reprivatize, and I'll talk about that, during the last decade of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Now, and in some respects, Arizona contributed enormously to the thinking because during the 1960s, Barry Goldwater was the first politician of national stature to begin to recognize that something was happening in our society and that we were losing control. And that was that crime was starting to increase and that government had to do something about it and citizens had to do something about it. Well, as we all know, Barry Goldwater didn't win. President Johnson did, and President Johnson created the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice, trying to form a liberal approach towards dealing with crime and lawlessness in American society. Now, there's much about that study that is to be commended. But basically, it put forward the same argument that was present in the war on poverty. And that argument was that crime was caused by poverty, racism, and social injustice, and that if police, if society was going to deal with crime, it had to deal with those problems. In other words, there had to be macro social change to deal with the problem of crime. That idea dominated criminal justice thinking for the last third of the 20th century. And again, it wasn't until the last decade of the 20th century that that idea really began to founder. That, of course, left everyone off the hook. If crime was caused by poverty, what did the police have to do with crime? If crime was caused by social injustice, well, one could develop arguments that maybe the police were unjust at times, but that was a different structural problem of society. And so the argument went, and that argument, by the way, is still dominant in universities and criminal justice programs and in a good share of the press, as they try and explain away some of the work that Bill did in New York City, Los Angeles, etc. We still hear those arguments. So that was the first major difficulty that confronted criminal justice and police during the 20th century. And that was, it simply was believed that there was nothing that they could do except to respond to crime after it took place. And what did that result in? It resulted in more and more imprisonment, longer periods of incarceration, and yet crime continued to climb during all that period. The other thing that happened was that police ran into serious difficulty during the period of the 1960s and 1970s. You will all remember that we had major riots. Well, some of you will remember, others of you will have read about it, but we had major riots during the 1960s. And what we saw was a rebellion against the style of policing that dominated cities at the time. And basically, people were saying, you cannot police us without our consent, which of course was a basic American value and a basic American idea, and ought to have been basic to policing, and that is you need the consent of the governed to govern, and we're seeing a lot of examples right now in the Mideast of that very principle. You cannot police us unless we consent. That was thrown at American police during the 1960s. Not only that, the Supreme Court came down on policing. And, you know, you can be critical of the Supreme Court, but the issue at the time was everyone knew in American policing that the most powerful investigative tool was torture. This was known in the Wickersham Commission during the 1930s. And finally, the Supreme Court said, look, we've given you 30 years to do something about this. You haven't done anything about it. So if you collect evidence illegally, we're simply not going to allow that evidence to be entered. But this was widely known, both within and outside of policing at the time. And then we had a lot of research during the 1970s that said despite the fact that the police had cars, despite the fact that they had a lot of technology, given technology at that time, given the fact that they had these ideas about law enforcement, nothing seemed to work. And so we got to the end of the 1970s in the United States with the idea that nothing worked that the police were doing, that the only solution that the police could apply was law enforcement, which was after the fact, and the idea that basically nobody was held accountable because it was simply problems of our society and the structure of our society. Starting in the 1960s, however, 1970s, however, some other ideas began to develop that ultimately led to a complete overhaul and reform in policing. And I would argue, and I think validly, that of all the public disciplines, right now policing is the most self-reflective, is the most changed, and has led in government thinking about how to operate efficiently and successfully with good outcomes. Now, the question of how this happened, we could go on for a long time, and we don't have the time here, but I'd like to talk to you about the ideas that developed in policing, in local policing. And by the way, let me make a comment, and that is that if you identify the ideas that I'm going to talk about, every good idea that reshaped American policing was developed locally. There is not a single good idea that came out of the feds. There's not a single good idea that came out of state police. The feds helped distribute some ideas, but it was local police, the innovation at a local level, the questions that were asked at a local level that led to the changes. Basically, I want to talk to you about 5 big ideas that reframed American policing during the 1980s into the 90s and then ultimately transformed policing. The first big idea had to do with the idea that there were problems rather than incidents. If you think of old-style policing, it was there'd be a call for service and you'd send a car. Another call for service, you send a car. Nobody was clear what the car was supposed to do, and the idea was handle the call as quickly as you can so you can get back in service. Now that's an interesting phrase when you think about it, in service and out of service. A police officer is in service in police jargon when riding around in a car. They're out of service when they're dealing with citizens, and the organizational pressure is to get back in service as quickly as you can. So how are you going to be dealing with citizens then? You're going to be dealing curtly, quickly, to get back in your car so you can wait for the next call. So policing was incident driven. Now what every good police officer knew was that there were problems out there. Because I'd ride with a police officer and we'd get a call to a particular address. Before we got there, he would tell me he or she would tell me what I was going to see. Because they kept going back to the same places all the time. And it turned out that the incidents were really symptoms of a problem. And it wasn't that you went to every tavern in Milwaukee, which has a lot of taverns, some 1,700. It wasn't that every tavern in Milwaukee was a problem. There were particular bars in Milwaukee, there were constant fights, and time after time police would be called, and that bar was a problem. And what Herman Goldstein, one of my colleagues, in fact my teacher, what Herman argued was that the police should be concerned about the problem rather than the incident. And that is, and for example, there's been several bits of research, and the police here know this research, and that is, I'm going to make these figures up, but they're close. Approximately 70% of the calls for service in any city come from 10% of the addresses. There are problem sites, locations, problem people that consume an enormous amount of police time, but until very recently, the police response to that was simply to respond to call after call after call without trying to deal with the incident. And it turns out if you start thinking about that, it suggests that maybe dealing with the problem bar is not just the responsibility of the police, but there are other governmental agencies who have responsibilities as well, zoning, liquor, etc. But anyway, I'll talk briefly about that. So the first big idea was that there are problems out there, and maybe the unit of work for police should be problems, not incidents. The second big idea, and now you're going to recognize what a humble fellow I am. The second big idea, this was developed in 1982 by me and James Q. Wilson. And I'm sorry about that, but I'm pleased at the same time. But let me give credit to the police who I learned it from. And that idea was broken windows. And broken windows is a metaphor. And broken windows metaphor goes like this. Just as a broken window left untended is a sign that nobody cares and leads to more broken windows, so disorderly behavior left untended is a sign that nobody cares and leads to fear of crime, more serious crime, and urban decay. Now, we knew the first line was right. We knew that if you leave a window broken, kids are going to break it again. And we knew that the first half was right and of the second line, and that was that disorderly behavior, minor offenses, bother citizens enormously and create citizen fear. But what Jim and I added to this was it also creates conditions in which the predators can thrive. And that is, if you don't take care of the minor problems, the big problems are going to start bothering you. And my first opportunity to implement those ideas were, of course, in the New York City subway. And if you wouldn't mind holding that up, I have a dirty old bag with me. I can afford a decent briefcase. But in 1988, when I first started to work in the subway, I bought that bag. It's never been washed. I carry it regularly. It reminds me of what happened there. And Bill will talk about that in more detail. But the second idea was that small things matter. And if you want to prevent crime, and notice now I'm starting to talk about prevent in different terms. Before, one would prevent crime, the idea was by social justice. Now we talk about preventing crime by solving problems or preventing crime by restoring order. The third big idea was this ancient idea, but it started to dawn on us, and this was the idea of in community policing. And that idea was you had to have the consent of the governed to police. That's the basic principle of a democracy. If you depart from that, but police departments all over the country, the attitude of police departments is, look, crime is a professional problem. It's our business. You stay up on your porches, if not literally, figuratively, and leave it to us. We'll take care of it. And they forgot all about the fact that in order to do that, first of all, they needed the consent, and it turned out that the police tactics were very unpopular. But later on, we discovered something else, that you needed consent was the bare minimum, but if you really wanted to succeed, you needed collaboration. And that's what I mentioned when I talk about zoning, liquor control, park departments, private industry, business improvement districts. It turns out that if police are to succeed, and I can't think of a problem that I've dealt with If police are to succeed, they need partners. They need the community. That's the essence of a democratic society. So it isn't just that at minimum you need consent. At most you need collaboration, and that, of course, properly throws it back to citizens in many respects. Because you have obligations, businesses have obligations, other segments of government have obligations, and they need to meet their obligations regarding crime every bit as much as the police. So the third big idea was the movement from consent to collaboration, and we call that community policing. Now, the trouble with community policing during the 1980s, the first round of community policing, was that politicians liked it, police administrators liked it, and the cops on the line hated it. It was social work. It was soft policing. They didn't like it. One group of police officers said to a colleague of ours, "You don't have to teach me about it. I know what it is. I just don't want to do it." And it was soft policing because we were still hung up on this idea that crime prevention occurred through massive social change. But slowly during the 1990s, not slowly, very quickly during the 1990s, that idea dropped away. And these ideas that we've been talking about began to really have impact. But there were two more ideas that I want to mention. One I'll just mention very quickly. How much time? Am I out of time? All right, I'll stop quickly. The fourth big idea was CompStat. I'm certain Chief Bratton will talk about CompStat. CompStat, C-O-M-P-S-T-A-T, is an administrative mechanism for developing accountability and crime analysis. And Bill and his colleagues invented it in New York City. It spread nationally, it spread internationally, and it's the biggest administrative innovation in policing in the 20th century. And it's terribly important. And it's built around the idea of holding people accountable. And Bill will give you this idea, and when you hear Bill, you'll understand. Bill told him, "I want a big decline in crime. Don't give me single figures. I want a double-digit reduction in these crimes." And he meant it. And he held people accountable for it. And it really mattered. And he did it. And the reason why I backed away when I said it took time, he did it in a matter of months. When we talked about community policing during the early days of the 1980s, we'd say, well, how long does it take to convert a department? And we'd say, well, 5 years? No, 10 years? Bill converted the New York City Police Department and the New York City Transit Police Department in a matter of months. They were converted police departments. He had a clear sense of message, bought in by the troops. If Bill had said take City Hall, his troops would have taken City Hall. That was the function of leadership and accountability that developed. And the last big idea was called pulling levers. And that idea was developed in Boston by one of my colleagues at Harvard by the name of David Kennedy and the Boston Police Department working with him. And that idea was, look, we know that a small number of offenders commit an enormous number of offenses. I see some heads nodding. I suspect they might be police officers. I don't know. But we know that 5% of the offenders commit more than half of the serious offenses. And the trouble is, everyone knows who they are. The police know who they are. The prosecutors know who they are. The courts know who they are. Everyone knows who they are. The trouble was, nobody was talking to each other. So in Boston, what they did was, now, and one other point I'll make about this. The bad news was, these guys are really active. They're committing major offenses. They're committing minor offenses. They get behind the wheels of cars and they drive like they're crazy. Jerks is jerks is jerks, and they continue to be jerks. That's the bad news. But the good news is, because they're so busy, they're vulnerable to be getting caught. And if they're vulnerable to getting caught, and the prosecutors are in on it, and the judges are in on it, and I'm not talking railroading here, I'm talking about people being held accountable for their offenses. For these offenders, don't plea bargain down. That you can target serious offenders and take them off the streets and reduce the total number of people we imprison. And Bill might mention about a little bit more about that. We call that pulling levers. And why do we call it pulling levers? Because these guys give you handles. Because they're so busy, You can wedge them. You can move them. Thank you for your attention. I enjoyed talking with you, and I'm certain we can have fun during question and answer period.
Good evening. I have a little different accent than George. Hopefully you won't need a translator for my Boston accent. A little heavy emphasis on the R's. This bag that George carried, he purchased it in 1988, 1989 in the Transit Museum. And it's really his self-defense bag. Because if he traveled the subways with the briefcase that he normally carries, looking like he does, he would have been mugged constantly. Carrying this bag, people looked at it and said, guy doesn't have a dime. So it was basically a self-defense bag. I want to spend about 20 minutes with you echoing or paralleling some of George's comments, but giving you a history lesson from the perspective of a practitioner. 40 years in American policing, Boston, New York, Los Angeles, but also experiences around the world and with many other cities in this country, including yours and your current chief of police. I have a very profound belief that in democracy, and it's echoed in George's paper, and I want to compliment the Goldwater Institute for sponsoring that paper because of what it tells you about the history of policing and the promise of policing in a democracy. George has written extensively and eloquently, and he writes in English. You'll find no formulas, algorithms in that document. As a police chief, if I open up a research document and it has a formula, I immediately close it. Because that's a researcher writing for another researcher. George is a practitioner researcher. He goes into the streets, he gets on the back of the police cars. When he didn't have knee operations, he used to ride around on the bicycle with the cops on bikes. He gets in there, he smells it, he feels it, and then he writes about it. And I've been profoundly influenced by his work because I've lived it, I've modeled after it, and the broken windows piece that he talks about was one of the seminal pieces in American policing and certainly in my career. And circling back to the comment about democracy, in a democracy, I think we would all agree that the first obligation, referenced in our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, first obligation of government has to be safety, public safety. Because if we live in fear, if we live in confusion, if we live in the midst of crime, all the blessings that are promised by our form of democracy are going to wither, or they're going to be too difficult to achieve. So the investment, and you'll never hear me talk about a cost of policing or public safety, because there is no cost for public safety. It's an obligation of government, but more importantly, it's an investment. It is an investment that pays dividends more so than almost anything else other than our national defense, which secures our freedom nationally and internationally. But on the home front, the dollars invested in public safety, if invested wisely, if used appropriately by police chiefs, politicians, police leaders, managers, supervisors, and cops, the dividends that it pays have been exemplified by the successes in the 1990s and continuing into the 21st century in cities like Los Angeles, like Boston, like New York, which I'm intimately familiar with. I have less experience with certainly the circumstances in your city and your state. But in the 1990s, government, both at the national level and at the local level, after the increases, steady increases of crime in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, decided to make an investment in a new philosophy of policing, the philosophy of community policing, a philosophy that emphasized three elements. Partnership. I say that a little differently than the way you would say it. Partnership. Heavy on the R. Partnership not only between police, local, state, federal, where we never had that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The feds spent most of their time investigating state and local police rather than working with them. Partnership with communities. Partnerships with communities to understand what are the individual priorities in the individual communities that make up our cities. Phoenix, as big and as diverse as your city, Certain areas have very different priorities and concerns than other areas. But policing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s tried to police cities as a monolithic entity, and they are not that. So the idea of partnership to focus on what are the priorities that are creating fear and disorder and concern in individual neighborhoods, and empowering the local police department to decentralize it so that the local district captain or precinct captain could be responsive to his or her local community and their concerns. Partnership that also focused on problem solving. George talked about the concept of problem solving. Instead of chasing those individual 911 calls, understanding that they were the symptoms of larger problems and focusing on them. Like dealing with malaria. You could swat mosquitoes from now to doomsday, individual mosquitoes, individual mosquito bites, individual infections of malaria. But until we drained the swamps and developed penicillin, we focused on the problem of what was causing malaria rather than the symptoms, we didn't deal with it. American policing in the 1980s and 90s began to focus on the problems and began to focus on partnerships that would help to solve those problems quickly. And thirdly, the return in the 1990s to the 1820s in London, England, when Sir Robert Peel advanced his 9 principles of policing. Principles based on the foundation that police exist to work with the citizens, for the citizens, and to be citizens, to be of the community, to live in the community. Everything old is new again. In the 1990s, we returned to the creation of modern democratic policing, with its emphasis on the prevention of crime. Not measuring our success by our response to it. In the 1960s, the commission that George talked about, that President Johnson put together after the phenomenal disturbances of the 60s, the anti-war movement, the crime problems, the race problems, a report that was issued that shaped American policing and American government policy for almost 30 years that was totally wrong. Because it excused police from responsibility for the prevention of crime. It said that crime was caused by poverty, the economy, demographics, racism, all types of societal issues, and that the police could not be expected to deal with those issues. So the police in the 70s and 80s, the emphasis was to become more professional. Better radio communications, better forensics, better training. I received my college education through federal grants. The idea was, while society tried to deal with all of those causes of crime, you, the police, get better at responding to crime. The idea that we were then measured in the 70s and 80s by our response time, by our arrests, by our clearances, by our convictions. But if you were the victim of a rape, or a robbery, or a theft, it didn't give you great satisfaction after the fact. You would have much preferred that it not have happened in the first place to you or your family or to your community. We had it, excuse the expression, ass backwards for the 70s and 80s. I know because I came into policing in 1970, 23 years old, all 150 pounds of me, 45 pounds ago, just back from the Vietnam War, and I grew up in that era of policing. I came in at just the time when I saw what was in the 60s that they were trying to change, the brutality, the corruption, the inefficiency, the incompetence, the total lack of leadership, and grew in the 70s and 80s. But fortunately, I didn't grow within the parameters that that commission had established in the 60s. Why? Because as I worked in the neighborhoods, as I moved up in the ranks of the Boston Police Department, I could see that it wasn't working. When I would go to community meetings with all my computer programs, and I was a computer whiz back in those days, designing the response plans for the Boston Police Department, measuring how long cops spent on calls, how long it took them to get to calls. And I had all the statistics about the murders and the rapes and the robberies. And I'd go to community meetings night after night, and people didn't want to talk about that. They didn't know about it because the media was not reporting a lot of it because there was so much of it. But they wanted to talk about what was happening in their neighborhood that was scaring the hell out of them. The prostitutes working on the corner with the pimps, the gangs of kids, the increasing drug usage, the abandoned cars that never seem to get taken care of, the broken windows that George and Jim Wilson wrote so eloquently about as they wrote about their experiences being out with police like me, who understood what our leaders did not understand, politicians or police leaders, until the late 1980s. That what the public was concerned with was certainly serious crime, but they also were concerned with what they were experiencing every day that was deteriorating their neighborhoods and creating fear. We, the police, the mistake we made for the 70s and 80s, we were excused from having anything to do with crime prevention and reduction and measured by a success responding to it. It was wrong. Fortunately, in the late 80s, early 90s, myself, other police leaders, academics like George Kelling, and interestingly enough, a national government that got it in the 1990s and supported the concept of community policing instead of the professional model of policing. Professional model of policing was about response, was about rapid response, was about random investigation. Remember good old Joe Friday? Just the facts, ma'am. My hero, the reason I went into policing. I grew up in the 1950s with good old Joe Friday, one of the first television shows I ever saw. Joe had 24 minutes back in the days when there were only 6 minutes of commercials in a half hour to solve that crime. But Joe was always about the professional police officer. Never put his arm around you, never a word of sympathy or compassion, just the facts, ma'am, because that's what policing was like. And the Los Angeles Police Department, which I was privileged to lead for the last 7 years, was the national model, that professional model. Rapid response, random patrol, remember good old 1 Adam 12, Reed and Malloy, and reactive investigations, good old Joe Friday. After the fact, it didn't work because crime grew exponentially in the 70s and 80s. Why? Because we're focused on the wrong issues. One, we're excused from preventing crime. What causes crime? Crime is not caused by demographics, a lot of young people. Crime is not caused by poverty or racism or unemployment or the economy. They are influences, and in some locations at certain times can be profound influences, but they can be countered, they can be acted against successfully. What causes crime is individual behavior. People who are either criminals or in a moment of passion commit a crime. Behavior. And what do the police exist for? We are the entity authorized under our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, our Declaration of Independence. We are the entity entrusted, empowered to enforce the laws that are passed. Our obligation is to do it constitutionally, compassionately, and consistently. And if we do that, and if we do it with many of the procedures and processes that were developed in the late 80s, 90s, and now into the 21st century, we can make a difference. Cops can count. Cops can matter. After 40 years in the business, I refuse to believe that the 40 years I spent in policing was of no value. Cops count. Police matter. They are an investment. And how did that investment pay off in the 1990s? The partnership with the federal government stepping up to support research, to support more police, to support laws, to support the police. 40% reduction across the United States in major crime, 30% reduction in overall crime. In cities like New York, in Los Angeles, reductions in crime of 60 and 70%. In the investment that we made in policing in the 1990s, in the concept of community policing, partnership, problem-solving, prevention, in the technology, in the ideas, in the leadership, in the transparency. One of the reasons why crime is continuing to go down in the United States, even in the midst of the worst recession since the Great Depression, in the city that I just left, Los Angeles, which was into a Great Recession 3 years before the rest of the country, crime didn't go up, is not going up even now, with 14% unemployment, with the police budget reduced by almost 15%, because the investment in the 90s, the residual benefits of the creative changes in leadership, in policing strategies and tactics, is continuing to pay benefits. And it is hoped that as the economy begins to turn around and influences Doesn't cause crime, but maybe an influence. In Los Angeles, it did not influence crime at all. In a city with one of the worst unemployment and economies in the country, crime has gone down for 9 straight years, and this year is down by about another 10%. Well, the police budget's been reduced by about 15%. Why? Because the cops know what the hell they're doing. Why? Because they're using technology. And one of the technologies they use, and I'll explain it briefly because George referenced it, as it was revolutionary, and I'm proud to have been part of the creation of it in New York City, is CompStat, short for computer statistics. It was based on a Tandy computer that we bought in Radio Shack, and to name the program, we could only put 8 letters in. So that's how CompStat came to be named. And literally a Tandy computer, because we were doing all of our mapping on flip charts and acetate. And that was the New York City Police Department of 1994. But what CompStat was about was the idea of transparency and accountability. 38,000 cops. I had a lot of cops in New York City. I had a great mayor, Mayor Giuliani, who had committed himself to the concept that government must do something about crime and can do something about crime. And he was very impressed with the work that George Kelling and I had done in the New York City subway system in 1990 and 91, when overall crime in the subways went down by almost 25%. Meanwhile, up in the streets, it went down by 1%. But in the subways, we were also focusing on those quality of life crimes. The 5,000 homeless in the subways who were living there, the vandals, the parasites that were preying on the 3.5 million riders every day. None of that was being addressed up in the streets of New York. So Giuliani campaigned on the idea after talking to George and I that something could be done, and something was done. Within 2 years of his election as mayor, and after 26 months as police commissioner before we had our differences and went our different ways, overall crime in that city was down by almost 40%. The homicide rate was reduced by almost 50%. But as importantly, police were dealing with what was creating fear every day in everybody's lives. The prostitutes, the drug dealers, the squeegee pests, the abandoned cars. We were listening to the public in every neighborhood of that city. 75 precincts. In 1994-95, every precinct in the city had double-digit declines in crime. Every precinct in the city was improving increased satisfaction with the police and the quality of life. Cops count, police matter. They are the most important investment that you can make with public dollars. Because if you make it safe, businesses will come and invest, jobs will be created, taxes will be paid by those businesses, by those employees, tourists will come, and there's more revenue to do more things. Now, the CompStat system, I'll close with this because George referenced it. It is so fundamentally simple. Walmart does it every Saturday morning with all of their managers. It is the idea of 4 basic principles. Timely, accurate information. Gather crime information every day. Put it on a map so you can start identifying hotspots. Where is crime actually clustering? So you can put cops on the dots. Whether you had a lot of cops like I had in New York, 38,000, or a few police like I had in Los Angeles, 9,000. Identify it quickly, the patterns and trends emerging, put the cops on there, and stop it. It's what a doctor does when he examines you for cancer. Watch that little melanoma on your skin. He wants to get in there and start treating it before it becomes a full-blown cancer. Timely, accurate intelligence, rapid response, cops on the dots, chemotherapy, radiation. Effective tactics, uniform, plain clothes, partnership with the feds on task forces. What will work best to deal with the identified problems? And lastly, relentless follow-up. The idea that crime is always going to be with us. That's the unfortunate reality of our lives, but it doesn't have to be there in the contagious forms that we experienced it in the 70s and 80s. We can do something about it. We now know how to do something about it, and we're getting better all the time at it. The opening lines of A Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens' book about the French Revolution. They were the best of times, the worst of times. In some respects, we are in the best of times as it relates to policing and public safety, because we have all these prescriptions that police chiefs, police leaders, the public, political leaders can draw upon. The secret is to draw upon them like a doctor, so that the right amount of prescription can be applied to the illness that's identified. They're the worst of times, certainly in many respects. The economy, crime situation here in Arizona, some of the particular issues that you deal with here, whether it's the issue of illegal immigration, some of the concerns about the drug cartels south of the border. But the good news is that these are issues that can be addressed, and they can be addressed effectively. CompStat's not brain science. Pretty simple if you think about it. Personal experience that my wife and I, we met in some respects through CompStat. I'm the former police commissioner in New York City. I'm having breakfast at the Regency Hotel in New York. I was in the midst of a divorce and I was living in the hotel. And I'm having breakfast with a friend, and across the room comes a woman dressed in this lovely red suit, 8 o'clock in the morning, with an older gentleman. And I look up and I recognize it's Ricky Kleeman, court TV anchor, somebody I'd known from Boston when I was police commissioner. And she approaches the table with a new boss. She figures she's going to get a couple of brownie points, introduce him to the very popular former police commissioner. And so she introduces Thea Bigelow, her boss. And I look up at Ricky, and she looked absolutely gorgeous, still does, even more gorgeous. And I said to her, how's this for a line, 8 o'clock in the morning? God, Ricky, you look so beautiful. If I was single, I would marry you. Those were the exact words that I said to her that morning at 8 o'clock. She hands me a card and says, maybe you should give me a call. Unbeknownst to me, she was in the midst of a divorce. She gets in the cab on the way back to work with the boss, and the boss says, he's going to call you. And Ricky says, you always exchange business guys. Said, no, he's going to call you. He was right. By the time she got back to the office, I had called. So what do we have? We have timely, accurate intelligence. I look at her, she looks at me. Rapid response, effective tactics. Effective tactics took us about 3 months to finally get out on a date. She was working nights. I was traveling all over the world. And then relentless follow-up. We're now married, coming up on our 12th anniversary. So CompStat was as basic as that, and it's not so complex. And it's what saved New York, and I would argue it's a system that's being replicated around the country. Policing is smarter. We have moved through the professional level that was a failure. Rapid response, random patrol. We need it. We still have to have it. We moved into the community policing area, which continues to expand and be more successful. Partnership, problem solving, prevention. We moved post 9/11 into the information age, where we get better at gathering information and analyze it to watch for those emerging patterns and trends so much more quickly. And indeed, we are now moving into the predictive policing time. Los Angeles, New York, many cities around the country with real-time crime centers, where there is the ability to literally predict with some certainty where crimes may occur, and you can put your cops on the dots before those crimes occur to actually prevent it. Might sound like science fiction, but it's happening today in America. So as we go into the 21st century, as we wrestle with the issues of budget, economy, and all the things that beset us, the good news is the first obligation of government, public safety, that finally in the 1990s we got it right. The challenge in the 21st century is to not fall back, to continue moving forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chief Bratton, Dr. Kelling. It is now time for questions from the audience. And if you'd like to go over to the microphone on the stand, it's available to whoever might want to line up and ask questions.
Hi. Wonder what you guys' responses to the Freakonomics guys who have a different theory about why crime was reduced in the 90s. I'm sure you're aware.
They don't know what the hell they're talking about.
Okay. But for the benefit of everyone else.
Freakonomics,
okay.
The thrust of as it related to, and because they specifically referenced me in that book, was in the issue of crime reduction. They attributed crime reduction to the issue of abortions. The idea that with the advent of the legalization, if you will, of abortions, that a lot of babies were not born, particularly to poor minority mothers who would have probably become criminals. And that was the thrust of the argument, if I recall it in summation. It's been pretty much disputed because if you think of it, 15 years before, 20 years before, birth control pills came into very wide and popular use. Why did we not see the same benefit with the use of birth control 15 to 20 years before? Because that would have been, what, the 1950s? Birth control pills became 1960s. 60s and 70s were our worst crime years ever. So that it sold a lot of books for them, but the argument was, I went crazy when I heard that argument. So that's my perspective on it. George?
I'll just second that and say, what do you expect? They're economists.
My question, just briefly, is has this program been implemented in Europe and Asia and South America and whatnot? And how's it going? How are they progressing with this?
Actually, they are nowhere near where we are in many respects. As much violence as we have in this country, that I think we are much farther along than many countries, even in Europe, which we would think to be more stable than most of the rest of the world. England, the property crime rates in England are much higher than they are in most of the United States, the property crime rates. England does not feel safe. England actually is going through, in these next several years under the new government, a phenomenal change in English police services, which they are seeking to adopt an American model of local control over their police departments. And the new government is intent on doing that. The belief that local communities are not served well by nationally led police forces. So watch England in particular, because they're going through literally a revolution. I do a lot of work in Latin America, and there's, with few exceptions, Santiago, Chile, now some of what's going on in Brazil, most of those countries just have nowhere near the professionalism and the efficiency of what we have here. We are not all that we would like to be, but we are, I think, much farther along than most of the rest of the world.
One of the problems with policing in a good share of other countries, that policing is a central government function. And the problem is you can't establish local accountability. And especially when you go to South America, Central America, European countries as well, mayors, for example, don't have any control over their police department. City managers don't have any control over their police department. All the priorities are determined centrally, and the idea of really on-the-ground familiarity of what the problems are is simply not present in these highly centralized systems. That's part of the reason why I revel in the idea that we have an uncountable number of police departments, because at best we can hold police departments accountable for what's happening in communities. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have some pretty rotten police departments, and we do have some pretty rotten police departments, but across the board, the police departments in the United States, because they're held locally accountable, are much more innovative and have led the world in research and success.
Dr. Kelling, Chief Bratton, tell us a little bit about your encounter with Hugo Chavez.
George and I, in the late 90s, turn of the century, were brought in by Mayor Peña, a newly elected mayor of Caracas, Venezuela. He had been the country's leading investigative reporter, and he came in at the same time that Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela. We were brought in based on our reputation of success in New York City, and we were asked to go into the most dangerous area of Caracas, where on a typical weekend there would be 50 murders in one weekend in one area of the city. And within about a 6-month period of time, using ComStat, using the idea, the revolutionary idea of actually putting police into those neighborhoods, because believe it or not, in an area of the city that had several 100,000 people, there were no police. But by putting about 300 police officers in there on motor scooters, because that's the only way you could get up into all these little favelas, within about 6 months, we had reduced homicides by 25%, and the trend was going down. In the meantime, the revolution that was continuing in Venezuela was moving forward, and the mayor fell out with Mr. Chavez, President Chavez, and the mayor had to flee the country. The police chief that we were working with, Ivan Simonovas, Ivan Simonovas sounds like he's a Russian, but he was actually a Venezuelan, one of the most progressive chiefs I'd ever met in Latin America. He was honest, he was competent, he was progressive. He's now serving a 12-year sentence in the prisons down there. And George and I had to get out of town. That we were at a meeting with a representative of the president, and the sense was that he was not happy with us. And as recently as about 6 months ago, a year ago, within a speech, Mr. Chavez labeled me as a counter-revolutionary. First time in my life I've been labeled a counter-revolutionary. And the only The only place I've ever had graffiti directed against me was Caracas, Venezuela. Bratton, go home. Or as they say it down there, Bratton, go home. So that was our Venezuelan experience. And the shame of it is, and because we're now doing consulting work in Chile and an initiative about to get underway in Rio, Rio in particular, terrible, terrible crime problems, but an honest police chief, a progressive police chief, and I think you'll see a lot of changes there. But these systems can work anywhere if government is willing to make an investment in their police forces, an investment in paying police officers enough that they don't have to shake down everybody, they don't have to be corrupt, and in professionalizing their police forces.
Come forward.
Hi, I'm retired, but I'm currently a college student majoring in criminal justice, and I did a research report on the broken window. I read both of your books, and I wonder if you'd be kind enough. I'm sorry.
It helps you sleep well at night.
Turn around. No, turn around was good. You did a good job. And I wonder if both of you would be kind enough to sign my report.
Happy to.
Would you please?
We could do that afterwards.
I'll kind of go around.
First off, what'd you get for a grade?
A.
A. Okay,
A.
we're very happy. We're very happy to sign it then.
I use your name, Chief.
But to get an A in criminal justice, you must have had to be critical of broken windows.
Quoted Robert Peel at the bottom.
The police are the public and the public are the police.
That's right. I think that was excellent.
There's a phrase that I meant to use in my speech. There's a phrase that I meant to use. Sir Robert Peel's principle of policing was encapsulated by the following, and this is a pretty close paraphrase. The public are the police and the police are the public. The only difference between the public and the police is we pay people to do what is everyone's responsibility. That's the genius of Anglo-Saxon policing.
Well, next question, please.
It seems like the two things you're really hitting on are accountability and transparency. And when I think about that, I think of other government institutions. You also meant, I mean, it wasn't really mentioned, but you did transform the prison system with the CompStat as well. I was wondering what would be the challenges when I think of accountability and transparency. I think of our public schools. And is there any way that you could use the CompStat, the weekly reports or whatever, to really transform the schools? And what would be the challenges of implementing that?
Actually, CompStat in New York is the sanitation that the school system uses variations and forms of it. I recently gave a presentation at the White House to 32 government agencies where the administration is pushing federal agencies to develop CompStat types of management accountability systems because they are transparent. If you think of CompStat, it's the idea of once a week or twice a week, I'd bring in the police precinct commanders to talk about crime in their precincts. What's working, what's up, what's down, what's not working. The transparency among them to share the ideas so they could take it back to their individual precincts. And accountability. The idea of, I transferred a lot of people. 75% of the precinct commanders were transferred in the first year of my time as police commissioner. But what was not fully understood, about a third of them were transferred out of precinct command because they were just not good precinct commanders. But about 50% of them moved up because they were very good. CompStat allowed me, as the police commissioner in a 50,000 person organization, to look deep into the bowels of my organization and identify talent as it was beginning to come up in the structure of the department. So CompStat is something that can work everywhere. Walmart every Saturday morning does CompStat. It touches bases with all of its regional managers. What sold this week? What didn't? What was the response to our advertising? It is. It's just basic. It's a basic accountability system.
Let me just add, and maybe this is organizational jargon, but basically CompStat is an interactive control mechanism in highly decentralized organizations. The problem, from my point of view, Bill can speak for himself, but as I saw Bill's problem in dealing with New York City when he took it over, here there were 76, 75 precincts, and during his career, he was never going to get to all 76 precincts. How does a manager of a large decentralized organization get his vision, his strategy, operated on throughout the organization? ComStat was the mechanism that he did that by bringing the people together in a face-to-face interaction on a weekly basis, focused around Bill's vision of what their job was and what he expected them to accomplish. So in that regard, those principles, I think, are translatable into schools, into hospitals, into any kind of organization. In fact, I can refer you to papers that describe these kinds of mechanisms in the private sector as well.
In the document that George wrote for the Goldwater Institute, which you all have copies of, you'll find about 2/3 of the way in 4 or 5 pages that have the profile sheets from ComStat. These are the sheets that for each of those precinct commanders by which I measured how were they doing in moving toward the goals of the department to reduce crime, fear, and disorder. Information on crime statistics, information on overtime expenditure, information on sick time. The management of the department was decentralized to the extent that it was transparent to everybody, but it was a way of me keeping a pulse on each of those 75 precincts that they were responding to the vision and the leadership, the goals and the strategies, and they were asked to develop the tactics to implement all of those.
Roy?
Wondered if either or both of you would comment on the appropriate role in your minds of the responsible, vigilant, armed citizen and groups like Curtis Sliwa's Guardian Angels. What's the appropriate role in solving the problem that you've been so successful with?
Well, I think those kinds of groups, properly motivated and in the proper relationships, are absolutely essential. And they would range from Curtis Sliwa's, and I know Curtis very well. I think the Guardian Angels were a serious attempt by young people to try and help and restore order. I think in a private sector, business business improvement districts, my senior moment of the night, are examples of private sector involvement. The area around Grand Central Station before Bill came was cleared up before Grand Central Station in New York City because of the Grand Central Business Improvement District. Bryant Park in New York City was a business improvement district. So it seems to me that there's a whole range of, from young people on patrol to business improvement districts, of involvement of the of private sector organizations in community crime prevention. Now, they can get out of line, and if they turn into vigilantes, of course, that's a problem. But the good news about that is, even during the worst days in the United States of crime, Americans were very reluctant to do much or any form of vigilantism during the 1970s and 80s. There was remarkable restraint on the part of the American public during that time.
Next question, please.
What's your opinion or your experience in where do you see the role of government employee unions, particularly those with police departments?
I have mixed feelings, being quite frank with you, about unions, because I've worked in jurisdictions with some of the toughest unions in the country. The Boston Police Union was the first union in the country that had collective bargaining capabilities, and they are one tough union to deal with, and city police commissioners and mayors have been battling with them for 45 years since their creation. It's been open battles for that whole 45 years. I was the police labor superintendent for a year and a half. That's where my first gray hairs began to come in during that time. There was a role for them because the horrific conditions that police worked under in the 50s and 60s, Boston in particular, and I experienced some of that because I came in just as that union was being created, that there is a role, but it's when they basically go beyond what is thought to be the role for unions, collective bargaining, et cetera, that it becomes problematic. But I always had the good fortune in working with three of the toughest and biggest unions in the country that we would agree to disagree, never got personal. In Los Angeles, which had spent $1.5 million getting rid of my predecessor, the union, that they weren't even allowed into police headquarters. I allowed them into headquarters. I had many meetings with them. Every 2 months, we would get out, my command staff, their leadership team, for dinner. I would write an article in their union newspaper every month that was never censored. New York City Police Department, last year, I got the Man of the Year award from the PBA in New York City, even though I've been gone for 15 years from that city. And even in Boston, although they sued me to prevent me from coming back to New York to Boston as police commissioner, once I did get back, that, again, we got on with business. So I think that the best of times, worst of times might apply to the issue of unions also.
Let me just make a comment about that as well. I've dealt with unions since the 1960s, especially in Milwaukee when they were first formed. It seems to me, and I mean this only semi-facetiously, the unions and cities deserve each other. Because I watched cities give away the future with pension plans and with early retirement. I watched politicians, and I won't name the city, reduce basically the work week to by about a quarter in exchange for political support when they ran for governor, when this person ran for governor. I think you know that story better than I do. But I think one of the problems that I think the general population faces is that there's some belief that collective bargaining in the private sector is akin to public bargaining in the public sector, and they're very, very different. And it turns out that the police unions play the game differently, better than cities do, because public sector bargaining is a political process rather than a financial process as it is in the private sector. And when unions don't get what they want out of the cities, they go over the head of the cities to state government, and they get what they want out of state government. Now, having said that, I've testified on behalf of unions in collective bargaining several times, and I've testified on only one issue, and that is the basic pay range of the line patrol officer. That's been my concern. And I can go into great detail about that, but I've warned them, keep me away from this early retirement, keep me away from pensions, because there are now cities that are paying 3 police departments, the equivalent of 3 police departments. The police department that's functioning and the other 2 that are retired. I think that the idea, and I don't know where Bill stands about this at all, I think this idea of policing 20 years and out is just bizarre, just because you got well-trained officers. We understand now that you don't need, we've changed the height requirements, we've changed all kinds of requirements in terms of strength, because policing now is a question, sure, you need some physical capabilities, but at the same time, policing is a thinking profession, a thinking occupation, and the idea that we turn people out at age 41, we retire them, and they get X percentage of their salary for the rest of their lives. I mean, but cities gave that away. They gave that away.
Next question, please.
Has the Mexican government asked for your help, and what would you do on the northern border of Mexico with all of the deaths that are taking place?
I recently, about 2 weeks ago, spent a full day with Alan Burnson, the head of Customs and Border Patrol, getting a day-long briefing. I'm the vice chair of the Homeland Security Advisory Council with your former governor, Janet Napolitano. And I'll be actually doing some touring of the border with him in the coming months and getting briefed on where they are now versus where they've been and the continuing efforts to reduce the issues of illegal immigration and a lot of the violence that's associated with it, and the concerns of the drug cartels, the violence that up until now has been pretty much confined to south of the border with some leakage, but concern that that might expand over time. So it is an area of very intense focus on the part of the federal government, the growth in the number of Border Patrol agents, and that, based on that briefing that I received, it is an area of continuing and expanding interest on dealing with it, with the idea that something can be done about it, the idea that creative policing, the idea that coordination, although the coordination with south of the border, that who do you trust type of situation is always extraordinarily problematic. But it is an issue in which there has been some progress seen based on the briefings I've seen. And also, like yourself, Los Angeles had many of the similar issues, those that you have in Phoenix, in terms of drug issues, illegal immigrant issues, the kidnapping issues. And we saw great progress in Los Angeles that in a lot of those areas with the partnership policing and the CompStat type systems and the focus policing. So it is an area that best of times, worst of times, once again, that sometimes the worst of times ends up creating the best of times. And the worst of times creates and attracts a lot of attention. And that's what happened with the crime situation in the 80s that led to the changes in the 90s. And I think similarly on these border issues, same thing, that it's causing a lot of additional attention and creativity to the issue. And I'm optimistic, even with the disorganization south of the border, that more can be done and a lot is being done.
I'll give a general comment. I won't specifically respond to that, and that is that, and I'll use as an example, after 9/11, after 9/11, there was a 9/11 commission that came out with a report about terrorism. You read that, you can be stunned. Local police are never even mentioned. And the good news is now that Bill is involved in these kinds of things. Other local chiefs are involved in these things, and they're again starting to use some of the local talent. It was just outrageous that that everything was considered to be a federal responsibility, and that the locals had nothing to contribute. We've organized along I-95 all the local. Bill and I started right after 9/11, recognizing this, started getting all the local chiefs together and local people in departments concerned about terrorism. But even now, for example, with dealing with this problem, I think there's a lot of wisdom out there that's now starting to be tapped, which is the good news.
I may follow up on that. George and I have spent a lot of time talking about one of the great strengths of American policing is its decentralization, the idea that with 17 or 18,000 police departments, that the average department being 10 officers, there is an ability at the local level to be very aware of local priorities. And increasingly with technology, et cetera, there's an ability to coordinate activities between all those departments and with federal agencies and state agencies. We talked about that President's Crime Commission report during Lyndon Johnson's time and how it misdirected American policing for almost 25 years. I hadn't thought of that, but the 9/11 Commission report, similarly, if we had followed its recommendations and never involved local policing, where would we be? A report was just recently issued by Homeland Security that of the threats, active threats, and attempts to carry out terrorism acts in the United States since 9/11, 80% of those were detected by local police efforts or citizens reporting to local police suspicions. So the billions upon billions upon billions of dollars that we have necessity spending on the federal level, if we had not begun, and American police chiefs were banging on the doors, because I was one of them, in 2002 and 2003, to be let in to work with the federal agencies on this, because Homeland Security is really hometown security. Just think, those 80% of incidents that probably would have occurred because the federal government did not have the capacity to deal with that issue. So that the strength that we have, and this even goes to the cartel issues and the concerns about the border, that it is a matter of better coordination, but also always understanding the importance of our form of criminal justice, our form of policing, with its heavy emphasis on local control and response to local incidents, and the coordination, when necessary, with the national government on terrorism or, for example, threats to our borders, whether it's the Canadian border or the Mexican border.
All right. Well, after the next couple of questions, we're going to wrap this up. So next question, please.
This is for Chief Bratton. I'm a former Springfield police officer, and I want to share with you that while I'm under the Quinn bill, sent me to college. In order for me to become a police officer, I had to add Quinkowski to get hired. All right? The chief of police was Chief Flynn. Captain O'Rourke was the captain of my watch. I was like one of the first Polish to come on the police department. Yeah. They did. I lasted 2.5 years. But my comment was, but anyway, the police unions really have a role to play, and I'll tell you why. If you do your job as a police officer, it isn't if, it's when some dirtbag tries to sue you. And the city will hang you out to dry potentially. And what the unions do is they allow you to bring your resources together and get world-class attorneys to defend you. That's the only reason why I joined the International Brotherhood of Police Officers in Springfield, Mass. It gave me that collaboration to protect myself against thugs out there who have the right to sue you as an individual. So I just was a comment for that. But what I wanted to ask you two gentlemen was, I didn't hear this comment, but when I came in the police department in 1979, it was the first time when the federal government, through their ability to fund police departments, if you want new cruisers, if you want radios, you want world-class technology, you need diversity in your police department. All right, that's what happened. And we got our first African-American female officer and our first Latino female. I want to get your comments how that has changed policing today when it was in the 70s when you came in 1971 in the Boston Police Department, which at that time was very highly Irish. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Very heavily Irish, and like most American police departments, very corrupt, very brutal, very inefficient. And I'm a great proponent of the changes that I've seen in the 40 years in the business. When I joined the Boston Police Department, there were 2,800 of us, all males, 55 African Americans in a city that was 25% African American, 5% Puerto Rican in a city that was 15% Puerto Rican. And the first female officer didn't join the department until 1978. First openly gay officer didn't come out till 1986. And I happen to believe that those changes strengthened American policing because basically we police all the people all the time. And not without issue, not without problems, but the diversity has strengthened us. And federal government played a role in the sense of, and we can disagree in the sense of the issues of affirmative action, but it did change American policing in many respects for the better. And I've had the opportunity to work with all of those people, African Americans, Latinos, Asian. In fact, now the Los Angeles Police Department during my time became a minority-majority police department, which reflects the city of Los Angeles, which is now a minority-majority city.
It gave me as a fellow police officer a lot more flexibility and tools and resources when I had diversity in the car. And depending on what neighborhood we worked together cohesively, and we were able to successfully resolve a lot more issues than if we didn't have that diversity. And I think that also helped to drive the improvements that we're seeing today.
question for both. I guess, would you guys say corruption is up or down in big city police departments? And what is the foundation, or what do you believe is the trend or foundation for corruption within a department today?
I'll speak from the experience of the practitioner, and when I came into the Boston Police Department in 1970, it, like most major American police departments that have been documented, were a mess. Systematic corruption. And there was a story in the Boston Police Department, one of our superintendents had a break-in in his house that, and the big concern was the $500,000 that was lost in that break-in. This is when the police superintendent was making about $15,000 a year. And we certainly, I think you're all familiar with the horrific stories of the 1970s, and indeed, one of my first acts as police commissioner in New York in 1994 was to go in and arrest 30 police officers in a police precinct who had been engaged in organized corrupt activities. Corruption is a part of policing. It's unfortunate. It's when it reaches 2 or 3% of a police force that it becomes really problematic that your department is starting to tip. But we are nowhere near where we were back then. That is one of the great strengths of American policing, American democracy, and the systems that we have that, unlike what's going on south of the border, where at all levels, local police, state police, federal police, national government, governors, the corruption is so widespread. Here in the United States, we see it, but we see it in isolation, and we don't see the systemic corruption that was so prevalent in the 70s and indeed going into the 80s. And I've worked in a lot of departments and have studied a lot of departments. It's a profession that has come a long, long way.
I would concur with that. I think corruption is way down, especially, and it would be much harder now to set up the kind of systematic corruption that arose from Prohibition and that dominated cities, even beloved Chicago for so long. When I was a teenager, I lived in Milwaukee, and I used to regularly go down to Chicago to try and sin. I never succeeded, but the word was, you always put a $5 bill by your driver's license. That world doesn't exist anymore. Pardon me? Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to again thank our two speakers tonight, Dr. George Kelling and Chief William Bratton, for their time and their insights. And I wanted to also thank all of you for coming and hearing the latest and greatest in policing from the two guys who did it all, who made our current success in policing possible. Have a great night.